Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this week I'm going to take you through building a slab dining table from start to finish. And as you can see there, this is an incredible slab from Gobi Walnut. It would retail for $3,600, but they were cool enough to donate it for this COVID-19 food relief fundraiser we're doing, where I'm building the table, they're donating the wood. So it's really cool for them to collaborate on this, because this would be the most expensive piece of wood that I'd ever worked with, despite the fact that I didn't actually have to pay for this one. I was pretty open when we started this project on doing either a live edge or a square edge. And the way this slab was oriented, it actually seemed to make the most sense for me to leave just a little kiss of a live edge. And you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. Because right now I'm just cutting it square with my Festool track saw. And a lot of people ask why I make so many passes. And if you use a saw, you'll learn that they're a little bit underpowered. They're super accurate and a really nice tool to have. But to get a good clean cut, you have to make several passes like I'm doing here. If you decide to take on a slab table project like this, part of what you're paying for is the condition of the slab. And besides a couple small cracks, the slab was actually in remarkable shape. So I had to clean up a little bit and the cracks here on top and a couple more on the front. But other than that, it was a really, really solid slab, which made this build go really smooth. So $3,600 is a ton of money for a slab, but that's you're kind of paying for the time you're going to save and the work needed to make this a suitable table. As I mentioned, I didn't have the intention of going into this with keeping a small live edge piece, but in the end, it was actually probably my favorite part of the table. So I wanted to keep it really natural, and I went ahead and used a nylon wheel on my Porter cable restored just to clean it up, but leave it pretty natural. All the cracks I'm going to be filling with a black resin, but that black resin can actually seep in and stain the wood itself. So first I'm going to seal all of the cracks with a clear resin using this air compressor here to spray that clear resin down in there to really prevent any color bleed. If you decide to fill any cracks similar to how I'm going to do here, I will save you the trouble and do not use painter's tape. I've learned from experience, more often than not, it will leak right through it. Use that Tyvek tape, and I'll include links to everything I'm using in the video description below, so you guys can know exactly the tools and products that I used for this build. But I am using a fast drying epoxy here. This is a West system. It works really well. Cures in just a couple hours instead of like 3 days, like the deep pour resins I normally use. So it's a good, really, really hard, it's traditionally like a boat resin, and it will work perfectly for these cracks. A good tip anytime you're adding epoxy to wood is to brush it into the sides like you see me doing there, and that's just going to prevent a lot of those little bubbles from clinging to the sides. I have a full video on how I cut these bow ties and then another full video on how I inlay them. So I'll go over this pretty quick here. If you do want a more expanded explanation of how I do this, feel free to click on the link to that video in the video description below. I rarely do contrasting bow ties, like doing a light maple wood, for instance, with this walnut. I really try to use wood, not just walnut, but walnut from the same slab that I'm working on, because it's so hard to match the color just right. And if you used a walnut piece from a different slab, there's a really good chance it would stand out and not match the wood in your particular slab. So try to use a piece of wood from your slab if you want a nice, clean look to your table. The cool thing about this jig that I use is that it only takes about 2 minutes to make, and so you can make several different jigs for different looks that you want. You could have a steeper, more traditional looking bow tie, and you can have a more slender, modern looking bow tie, all with just a couple minutes work. If you were wondering how I was going to fill those gaps on top of the slab that you saw me clean up at the start of the video, this is the best way I could think of. And it wasn't perfect, but it actually worked pretty well. So I just put a little bit of that Tyvek tape on the back, and then I came back and it took me about 3 or 4 pours to fill it up completely with that fast drying resin. Oh, and if you decide to use this tape, you're going to have to use heat to remove it. Otherwise, it's a complete mess. It's still kind of a mess doing it this way, but it works a lot better than without it. I don't have a video out on adding these splines like I'm going to show you here in just a second. I probably wouldn't do this on the top of a table. It's not quite as precise as my hand-cut bow ties, but it works really well for securing some cracks that you just aren't sure enough and not having to spend all day hand-cutting bow ties. And all we are essentially doing is cutting a straight spline that we're going to put a straight piece of wood with epoxy in there. And some of you are probably thinking, how is that going to be as strong as a bow tie, since the bow tie kind of has that wedged mechanical joint? And the quick answer is it's not going to be as strong as a bow tie, but it will be pretty strong. And these cracks aren't really a high risk one that I'm worried about separating. This is the back side of the table, so I'm just adding them just to be a little bit more secure in knowing that the cracks aren't going to separate. Just make a little micro crack on that epoxy resin that I filled it with. The big advantage to doing them like this is that I can do about 6 of these in 30 minutes, where I generally spend about 30 minutes per individual bow tie that I cut. So using a 3/8 inch round over bit there to match my 3/8 inch spiral bit that I cut them with, and they're going to fit pretty good. But like I said, they're not perfect in there. They're not quite like a CNC fit. And if you are going to do them like this, I do recommend epoxy, because that is going to have a little bit more shear holding power than like a wood glue, since these aren't wedged in there with that mechanical holding force that a bow tie has. I let these dry overnight, came back with my belt sander. I think I had 80 grit, which is pretty aggressive, and I'd be a little bit more careful if I was going to do that on the top of the table, but this is by far the fastest way to smooth out any of these bow ties or splines. I thought that the square edge of the table looked a little bit boring, so I decided to go ahead and cut a 22-degree chamfer. And sometimes I call it a bevel incorrectly, and there's always some people quick to jump in to tell me in the comments that I incorrectly called it a bevel when technically it's a chamfer. So using my track saw to cut this 22-degree chamfer here, and it's just going to give it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more modern look. And using the track saw to cut this chamfer was something I actually had to do out of necessity a couple of videos ago, because I couldn't find a router bit big enough, and it ended up being a much better, much cheaper alternative than having to buy these huge industrial router bits. So what I did is I overlapped it about 1/4 of an inch, make sure that it was overlapped uniform the whole way, came through, cut my chamfer, and everything lined up just perfect. I get asked fairly often about inlaying these bow ties and what do you need, and do you need expensive chisels? And really the only answer is you need sharp chisels. And I'm using my Tormek here to sharpen up my blue spruce chisels. They are pretty nice, pretty expensive chisels. You really don't need expensive chisels. You just need to make sure they are absolutely sharp. You don't absolutely have to have a marking knife like these Japanese ones I have there. You could use like an X-Acto knife, but they just get dull really, really fast. So for like 20 bucks, get yourself a good Japanese style marking knife and you won't regret it. Some of you will probably ask, do I really need 2 bow ties here? Why isn't one good enough to hold this crack? And honestly, I don't even know that I need 1 bow tie here. This was kind of a big black void with all that epoxy there. So this is more of something just to break it up aesthetically and make it look a little bit cleaner. If you haven't watched one of my videos before, or more importantly, if you haven't commented in one of my videos before, you might be surprised to know that I actually respond to pretty much every single question or comment you guys leave below, because I know it's frustrating if somebody rushes a certain part or isn't clear, and to be left not knowing if you need to do a certain part on your project. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section below. And the only thing I ask is, if you like this video, please subscribe for more, just like it, because it really enables me to keep producing content like this. As far as the actual inlay process, it does take a little bit of practice, but the most important thing is get a good sharp outline of your bow tie or whatever you're going to inlay with your marking knife or X-Acto knife, and then just really slowly take tiny bits off with your chisel till you get up to that line. And eventually you're going to set your chisel right in that line you made with your marking knife, and that's going to give you that perfectly tight, perfectly sharp fit with your bow tie in the end. If you try to take too much wood off at any given pass with your chisel, what you can actually do is compress the wood fibers, and that's going to leave a gap and a poor fit and be kind of ugly when you inlay your bow tie. So what they say to do is to take half of the wood off again and again and again until you can no longer get your chisel anywhere but right in that groove, and then make your final pass with it right in that marking knife groove. After you get your bow tie negatives cut, it's a good idea to go and cut some reliefs on the back side of your bow tie. And I'm doing this with a chisel here. You could also use like a spindle sander, or even be careful with a belt sander. And this is giving the glue somewhere to go. And it's also going to help line it up and go in a little bit easier. So just cutting a slight chamfer. Doesn't have to be anything too exact, just enough of a gap for the glue to go somewhere. I mentioned using epoxy for those splines, and I specifically don't recommend using epoxy for bow ties, and I've used it before, and what it does is it leaves a distinct dark outline around your piece no matter what you do. So use wood glue. I like this Titebond 3. I'll include a link to this in the description below, but do not use epoxy for your bow ties. It just leaves a really ugly dark line around them. You do need to be a little bit careful when you decide to go for the inlay here, because once it goes in, it's probably not going to come out. So that's why you see me using this piece of softwood here to help pound it in a little bit more evenly. And a tip that I do, and it's not something I invented by any means, is adding this walnut dust. And the one thing I do a little bit unique is I'll mix in a little bit of maple dust, and that's just to give it a little bit of a breakup so you don't have the same dark walnut dust outline around your piece. You'd have a little bit of a natural variation like you would normally in the wood with that lighter dust. You always want your bow ties to be slightly proud, and that's because it's a lot easier to take 1/8 of an inch off of a bow tie than it is to take 1 millimeter off of your entire table. So this is what I ended up with in the end, and overall I was pretty pleased with myself. Not really any visible gaps, so overall, not too bad. And since this table was for charity, we had some really cool collaborators. And one of those collaborators was Flowy Line Design, who donated his wishbone legs, which I love that style. And I was going to just mount them straight onto the slab, but then I thought it'd be a little bit cleaner if we went ahead and recessed them in there so that top plate doesn't show. And I'll have a video out in the next couple weeks on how to mount your legs similar to this. It's a pretty easy shop-built jig. The most important thing to note if you're going to recess your legs into your tabletop is that don't try to get them perfectly tight in there. What you want is that wood to have room to expand and contract seasonally around it. That's why you see about a 1/4 inch gap all the way around the perimeter of this table base. Another collaborator we had was Canadian Woodworks, and they really generously donated their steel C-channels. And I actually do have a video on how to inlay these so they're perfectly flush with the bottom of your table. So really quick, I'm just using the 1/4 inch bit to cut the slots, coming back with this 1/2 inch bit to cut the recess for the top, and that's gonna allow that steel bar to sit down there flush. The only thing you have to do by hand is kind of round over this edge a little bit to allow that radius of the C-channel to sit down there perfectly flush like that. And since my jig didn't go all the way to the edge, I will have to hand cut this square edge just to clean it up a little bit and give me a good excuse to break out the nice Japanese chisel here. I know I said earlier that you don't need nice expensive chisels to get a really good cut. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have nice expensive chisels. And this is probably my nicest one. This is a handmade Damascus Japanese chisel. So it is fun to use, but no, you don't really have to have that to cut straight lines. After I got all my C-channels cut and the legs recessed, I was ready to move on to sanding. And sanding is probably not the most fun thing to do, but it is maybe the most important step in this. And I have a blog post where I go through all of my sanding process, including all the grits that I use the whole way through. And it takes a long time, but this is what's really going to separate the mediocre tables from the truly beautiful tables. And if you can't tell, I am sparing you having to watch me sand each side at every grit. I did sand the underside to 150 grit, which is not quite as high as I'm going to sand the top to. So it is okay to go a little bit lower on your underside than you do on the top, because I get that question a fair amount. But really just going through painstakingly, making sure I get every imperfection filled. This is some CA glue with an activator that I'm filling some tiny little gaps in those epoxy cracks that I filled. It cures in just a few seconds, so I'm able to fill a ton of little imperfections pretty quick, although I do spend quite a bit of time, as you can see here, filling and filling and filling and sanding and filling, but it will give a really nice look in the end. And a little tip I'll give you is what I do is I sand my tables up to 150 grit with my finish sander here, use my Festool sander, and then after 150 grit, I go through and I'll bring out my trim router. And what I keep in this is an 1/8 inch roundover bit, so I never have to adjust the height. It's always set perfectly. Hit it with the 1/8 inch roundover bit, then I'll come back, do my hand sanding with my handy sanding glove that I made there. And that way it's gonna make the edge much nicer than if you sand it all the way up and then have to go back and then hand sand these corners, because your hand sanding is going to leave these kind of ugly scratches where your orbital sander is going to leave pretty much a perfect finish. So if you can sand it up to 240 with your hand and then come back, sand the entire top up from 150, you're going to get a much nicer finish than if you were to try to hand sand it after getting all the way up to your final sanding grit in the end. The finish I decided to use for this table was Odie's oil, and I have had some problems with Odie's oil in the past. It can be a really hard finish to get just right. So I spent quite a bit of time talking to my friend Matt of Earth Furniture, who's kind of an Odie's expert, and he really schooled me up on it, because the one thing about Odie's is if you get it right, it leaves an absolutely beautiful bulletproof finish. So next week's video will be all about how to apply this Odie's oil, which is going to be how to apply an absolutely perfect finish in your shop or garage with just a rag. You don't need any expensive buffers or anything like some of my finish videos in the past, but it can be tricky to get right, so definitely worth watching next week's video if you want to try Odie's oil for yourself. If you want the Cliff Notes version of how to apply Odie's oil, essentially use as little oil as humanly possible and make sure you buff off absolutely every last milliliter of it. Don't leave any on there using these cotton rags. And that's a way oversimplification. Next week's video will have a lot more on it, but that's how you apply Odie's oil. You can see the C-channels fit in there just perfect along with the legs, but we already knew the legs were going to fit because we tested those earlier. Now we just need to add some threaded inserts and some furniture bolts. And so how I do that is I start with a brad point bit, and that's just to get perfectly in the center of these. And I just tap a little mark to get right in the exact center of all my legs and my C-channels. You can see that Flowy Line gives a ton of mounting options there, and you don't have to use every hole just because it's there. I believe I used 8 per leg, and that was going to be more than enough. I think there was 12 spots available. But when you're adding these threaded inserts, the most important thing is to follow the manufacturer's instructions and use the right size drill bit, because I used to use a little bit too small of a bit, and it could make them really hard to get in there, which could actually crack your table if you really forced it in there. So this was a 10.5 millimeter bit, which was kind of hard to find, but it does make it worth it in the end. And the last little bit you need to make sure you get just a perfect recessed threaded insert is to use a countersink like this. And you don't have to use the countersink, but it does give a cleaner look and it won't have any chip out at the top. So quick countersink, and then when you go to thread these in, they should go in nice and easy. I use just a dab of wood glue for lubrication and to keep them a little bit more secure, but it gives a perfect fit in the end. I have used a ton of different threaded inserts, and make sure you use a good solid steel insert. Don't use the ones made from zinc, and don't use the ones made from brass. The brass ones look nice, but they strip out. They're just worthless. Don't use those. So I'll include links to these, but do get a good solid steel threaded insert. Anytime you're bolting something like table legs or these C-channels to a big wood slab, you need the wood to be able to expand and contract seasonally around the steel. Don't just snug it up as tight as you possibly can get it. You want to get it just barely snug so the steel is going to stay flat, but the wood can still move around it seasonally. So that's why I use that thread lock, so the bolts wouldn't back out at all, and once I had them in there, they'd stay right where I left them. Since I was going to be taking these legs off to ship them to whoever wins this sweepstakes, I didn't want to put that thread lock on there. But if they were going in my house, I would probably opt to put that thread lock on there for my personal use. And there we are. We have the finished table here. You can see the bow ties that I cut that I was pretty proud of. The color was amazing. I loved how this Odie's oil highlighted this natural black walnut slab. Overall, could have been happier with this project. We still have a week left in the contest. If you do want to win, it's 20 bucks for a ticket. There's a link in the description below. But overall, this was one of the nicer tables I built and was incredibly honored to be a part of it with all the collaborators we had. Really good cause and a pretty cool table in the end. And if you want a couple things to really set yourself apart, if you're a new maker, you really want to do that heirloom quality table, take the extra time, add the C-channels, recess your legs, and if you want some bow ties, spend the time to get some really nice, clean, sharp hand-cut bow ties. And as some of you probably know, every week I like to give a little bit of credit to the people that actually watch the entire video. So start your question or comment with the state, the country, or both that you live in, and I will know you watched the entire video, and I promise I will get to all of your questions or comments first. So thanks so much for watching this week. Please subscribe for more videos just like this. Have a good one.